Welcome, future managers. So, you're studying Introduction to Management, and you probably already know that memorizing the concepts in your textbook, well, that's really only half the battle. The actual test is applying them in the real world. In this explainer, we're going to learn how to survive and honestly thrive when dealing with one of the most common yet notoriously complex aspects of organizational life. I'm talking about group work and committee management. We're going to bridge that gap between the theoretical ideal of how groups should function and the very messy reality of how they actually operate out there in the wild. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the plural executive concept. Compare board expectations versus reality and look at the rules for successful committees. Then, we'll cover the drawbacks, avoid some common misuses, and wrap it all up with a real-world case study on university committees. All right, part one, the plural executive concept. Okay, let's dive straight into the highest level of formal group decision-making you're ever going to encounter in management. Now, when you hear the word committee, you might just picture a group of people sitting around a big table, giving advice or tossing around opinions, but the textbook definition highlights a really critical distinction. A plural executive is a managerial committee that is actually given the power to make decisions and undertake core managerial functions. So unlike a standard advisory committee that just deliberates and hands a tidy little report to a boss, a plural executive holds genuine operational power. They don't just suggest things, they execute them. Because they hold this kind of sheer power, plural executives are fundamentally policy-making bodies. A lot of large companies form these executive or management committees under heavy-hitting titles like the Corporate Policy Committee or Operating Policy Committee. And their task? Developing basic policies and adopting major strategies. Their influence on decision-making is massive, especially when we're talking about strategic planning. But it doesn't stop there. They also engage in control, basically ensuring that the company's day-to-day activities actually fall in line with those high-level strategic plans. Now, here's another really fascinating aspect of the plural executive, its role in conflict resolution. It turns out, the plural executive is an ideal negotiator of disputes. You might wonder, why is that? Well, psychologically and practically speaking, a settlement reached by a group of peers is usually way more acceptable to the arguing parties than a decision just handed down from on high by a single, solitary boss. A group decision just feels more balanced, it feels more considered, and definitely less like a personal dictatorship. Moving on to part two, boards, expectation versus reality. Let me ask you a question. As an upcoming manager, you might think that simply putting a board of directors in a room guarantees you have a functioning plural executive, right? Well, let's look at the expectation versus the reality here. According to the academic theory of a plural executive, the expectation is that the group formulates policies together, with each member carrying equal weight in the deliberation. Everyone has a voice. But if you walk into most corporate boardrooms today, the gritty reality is quite different. Very often, a chairman or a president acts as a dominant single executive. That one powerful person is actually calling the shots, formulating the policies, and driving the agenda, while the rest of the board members, they often act more like mere advisors rather than equal decision makers. And this brilliantly illustrates why, despite what you might assume, a typical board of directors is not a plural executive proper. Because that single executive often formulates the policies on their own, the board seldom functions as a true, equally weighted decision-making group. It's honestly a perfect example of how clean organizational theory can completely clash with messy organizational behavior. Let's jump to Section 3, Rules for Successful Committees. Knowing that the reality is often pretty messy, let's shift gears to your practical toolkit. How can you, as a future manager, ensure that the committees you set up are actually successful and not just a frustrating waste of everyone's time? Well, it starts with the math, 5 to 15. As a general rule, this is the absolute optimal size for a committee. If your group is smaller than 5, you might really lack the breadth of expertise required to tackle the job. But if it creeps above 15, the group just becomes way too large. A massive committee fosters indecision, it severely limits communication, and frankly, it just wastes a lot of time. So 5 to 15 is your sweet spot to promote healthy deliberation without totally bogging down the process. Next up is leadership. The chairperson of the committee absolutely must be competent. A great chairperson is literally the glue holding the whole committee together. They minimize a group's natural flaws by carefully planning the meeting, preparing a laser-focused agenda, and most importantly, integrating different ideas judiciously. The success of a committee doesn't just rest on the members. It rests heavily on the leadership chops of the person sitting at the head of that table. And here is an incredibly simple, yet absolutely critical rule. Always circulate meeting minutes in draft form for correction before they are finalized. I mean, have you ever left a conversation thinking you agreed on one thing, only to find out the other person had a completely different takeaway? We've all been there. In a committee, varying interpretations of what was actually agreed upon can cause utter chaos. By sending out a draft of the minutes first, you give everyone a fair chance to correct or modify the record before it becomes official company policy. All right, Section 4, the drawbacks of committee management. Now, we do need to transition into the dark side of committee management. If you have ever felt the absolute soul-crushing frustration of a college group project, you are already intimately familiar with the drawbacks we're about to discuss. What's really interesting about these organizational hazards is how they highlight two interconnected threats. First off, committees are expensive. They consume a massive amount of time and monetary cost, especially when they're assigned tasks that one individual could have solved just as easily. Second, there's the agonizing reality of indecision. Committees have this terrible habit of devoting lengthy meetings to unnecessary hair-splitting over peripheral, completely unimportant subjects, and then they often adjourn without taking any real action at all. Furthermore, committees frequently produce weak decisions. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Think about it. In a group of peers, people naturally seek politeness, humility, and mutual respect. They really don't want to force a conclusion on a reluctant minority member. And because of this strong desire for harmony, the group tends to just compromise at the least common denominator. A bold, strong strategy gets completely watered down just so that everyone can agree on it, and that results in a fundamentally weak decision. Which brings us right to the issue of accountability. So the crucial point is this. When a decision is made by a committee, the responsibility is split. Because no single member feels personally accountable for the actions of the entire group, individual members just don't feel the same degree of responsibility they would if they were tasked with the job alone. Actually, it's like the old saying, when everybody is responsible, nobody is responsible. Nobody feels personally on the hook, and that leads to a very weak commitment to the final outcome. Section 5. Avoiding common committee misuses. To protect your future organizations from these drawbacks, let's go through a rapid-fire survival guide on what not to do. Number 1, never use a committee for unimportant decisions. It wastes highly expensive executive time. Number 2, never use them to replace a line manager. Committees should advise, but real decision-making should be left to the line executive. 3, do not use them for decisions that are way beyond the participants' authority. This usually happens when executives send unempowered subordinates to meetings. 4, don't use committees just to consolidate poorly divided authority. You need to fix your organizational structure instead. And finally, number 5, never use a committee for research or study. Gathering information and doing monumental research requires individual devotion and a very specific bent of mind. A group meeting is literally the worst place to conduct deep, focused research.
Let's wrap up with Section 6, a real-world case study on university committees.
Let's put this all into perspective. We're going to look at a highly bureaucratic committee structure, the appointment and promotion process at the University of California. Watch how this builds into a towering hierarchy. For a candidate to get tenure, they first face their department staffing committee. If they pass that, the case goes to the campus budget and promotion committee. Then that committee refers it to a specially appointed ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee sends its recommendations back to the budget committee. The budget committee then sends its recommendations up to the executive vice chancellor and chancellor. They review it and send it to the university academic vice president and president. And if it's favorable, it finally goes to the regents for final action. That is a single human being's career, traveling through 6 exhausting, incredibly time-consuming levels of committee bureaucracy. Which leaves us with this final question to close out our explainer. How would you like to be reviewed for appointment or promotion by this kind of hierarchy of committees? As you step into your roles as future managers, I really want you to think deeply about the human impact of the organizational structures you build. Are your committees going to be efficient tools that empower your team, or will they be bureaucratic labyrinths that drain time and dilute responsibility? The choice and the managerial design will be entirely up to you.